Windows 365 has been out in the marketplace for about 18 months now. In fact, it will be 18 months on February 2nd because it did go GA on August 2 of 2021. It's amazing to think that we are now in 2023, but it's been a wild and exciting ride. So what I wanted to do today, we are going to talk about cost savings and benefits and things like that, but I really want to kind of take a little bit of time to talk about what's changed in Windows 365, what makes it more compelling than maybe it used to be. What are some common misconceptions and challenges that we hear people encountering or expecting to encounter as they look at Windows 365, and then kind of dig into some of my favorite use cases that we have seen as we have been doing Windows 365 deployments. So with that, let's kind of dig in a little bit here and talk about what it is, right? So in order to understand where it's come from and where it's going, let's talk a little bit about what it is and the challenges that it's designed to meet. So Windows 365 is the new concept of this cloud PC, right? And Satya Nadella has spoken on stage about it. And we actually have a pretty extensive body of work that's already out on YouTube. This content will go out on YouTube within the next couple of days. Highly encourage, once it lands, take a look inside of our playlist of Windows 365 content. I meant to say this up front, but if there's something that you don't hear answered today, there's actually a pretty good chance that we have the answer already in content that's out there already. So anyway, so Windows 365, a cloud PC, right? We're taking the concept of VDI and dramatically simplifying it to simply delivering PCs that users can directly connect to out in the cloud. And the way that it works is like I said, it's a fundamental simplification of what we've done with VDI, right? In the past with VDI solutions, we typically would purchase compute from one pile, then we'd purchase storage from somewhere else, then we'd purchase some network, and we'd bring them all together, wrap them up with some middleware management plane, right? And maybe even some sort of a scaling presentation layer, right? Something that allows things to scale up, scale down, and put all of those things together, all with different licensing structures and models to deliver a very granularly tailored experience for our users. Most of those choices were met with some level of compromise along the way. With the cloud PC, though, what we're doing is we're saying, you know what, Bob needs a computer. Bob has web access through something he already has at home, or maybe he has an older computer. We want to refresh that, and we want to control it, and we want to be able to manage it with our existing management infrastructure. We don't want to bolt on any new complexity. We're just going to spin up a machine in the cloud, and whenever he connects to it, it's the exact same persistent session that he had last time. This can be somebody who's working from home. It could be any number of things. In fact, Microsoft has gone to the trouble of identifying some pretty common expected key workloads, right? And we have talked about these too. Again, we have a pretty lengthy body of work already out on YouTube for you to explore and take a look at. But the 6 main areas that were identified by Microsoft as key workloads for Cloud PC or Windows 365 were these. Bring your own PC, right? Security access even from personal devices. This is a critical consideration in the hybrid era, right? Some people may want to be able to start and work for your organization on day one. It can be very costly and time consuming to get a device shipped to them, and maybe they actually already have a device. In fact, most of the time we're doing video interviews with organizations now, likely with something that's already existing. We can get them up and running on day one. Temporary workforces. We have some really cool use case scenarios that we've seen around temporary workforces and some amazing reductions in both time to support and time to deploy, and just the keeping guardrails around what they're able to do. Mergers and acquisitions, data security, high capacity compute, all that stuff is really cool workloads. But what we also just recently got was this report that was commissioned by Microsoft, that talked about where they are seeing the cost savings across Windows 365 deployments. And what I think is really fascinating is that whether you're looking at a 1,000 seat organization or 250 seat organization, because these are the models that they ran, you can see approximately a 50% annual per user benefit in delivering systems to your temporary workforces, which is actually really wildly cool, right? The report actually goes on to say something like a 1,600% reduction in time to delivery for a temporary worker. And actually, even stepping outside of Windows 365, we did a webinar 2 years ago where we live deployed a machine from bare metal inside a Hyper-V all the way up to a productive user logging into Outlook, and it took I think 19 minutes. Windows 365 is operating like that, whether you're deploying one machine or 1,000 machines or whatever. So that ability to get up and running that quickly is staggering, and it really simply can't be achieved with most of our traditional workloads for managing devices. Also thought it was very interesting that if we look across the other areas around remote users, across initial onboarding to bring your own PC to even offboarding and device recovery, those aggregate on both sides to about a 35% cost reduction or annual per user benefit, right? So there's some real serious money to be saved by looking at a cloud PC, even if we take out the actual cost to buy the machine up front, because that is something that we can't ignore, but we'll get to the money stuff in a little bit later on too. The other things that we have to really think about when we're talking about deploying new devices to users is we are still in a hybrid era, right? A lot of organizations thought that was going to be going away, but we actually, you might notice that I am not in the studio today. We are very much living in a hybrid world right now, right? So I'm excited that I get to be up here working in my house and doing things. I'm going to be back in from time to time, but I have to have that flexibility. And we see that workers are going to continue to demand that flexibility. And the real interesting challenge that that imposes on our traditional VDI infrastructure, and we talked about this last year too, is this concept of a triple peak day, right? And we've seen some really amazing optimizations that folks have done with Azure Virtual Desktop, with Citrix, with all sorts of these traditional VDI models where they scale up really big in the morning and then they scale down really nicely at night so you can save on resources. But when users log in right before they go to bed to do that one last blip, or maybe they've come home from a solid workout, maybe they snuck out a little bit early, but now they're coming back in to do that third session. This is typically outside of those scaled down windows. So our systems are scaling back up at night to support those users. And then maybe we actually don't have the automations in place to scale them back down again because that's not a predicted workload. So Windows 365, by delivering a persistent experience at a fixed cost per month, allows us to avoid all of the complexities that come along with that, along with, again, those secondary billing concerns that come from using those additional systems more than we would expect. So let's talk about what has changed in Windows 365, because we've gotten a lot of really cool benefits and usages and improvements over the last, gosh, I think it's been 9 months since we put together a public-facing video or webinar on Windows 365. So some really neat areas that we've gotten have been around localization. We can deploy Windows 365 in multiple languages, and we'll get through kind of most of this, but I won't drain 100% of it. But performance and utilization reports simply didn't exist initially. We have a new Windows 365 app that we're expecting to see more and more features and functionality come to over time. Graph support, so now we can actually do both PowerShell and application deployments targeting Windows 365, and some really cool things that you can then do with logic apps to then make your Windows 365 exponentially more powerful than what you might get out of the box. RDP Shortpath has delivered like a 5-fold increase in performance for users, especially for me out here in the country. And then the ability to place devices under review, along with single sign-on and GCC and GCC high capabilities, have really improved our ability to deliver and secure and produce compliant compliance capabilities within that cloud PC experience. Now, there is a public roadmap for Windows 365, and it is out with the rest of the Microsoft 365 public roadmap. So this is nothing that I'm going to show you here is unavailable to you. At the moment, there are 15 items on the roadmap. Some are in development and some have been fully launched. A lot of this stuff is the content that we're going to be talking about right here. There have been some improvements around the business licenses as well. We do expect that we're going to be able to do disk encryption, right? We see that's coming up here too. But again, we're not going to talk about 100% of what's on here. What I want to do is dig into some of my favorite things. And the first and probably the biggest one has been around the Windows 365 app. So what you're looking at right here, when the users log in for the first time or anytime, honestly, to windows365.microsoft.com, the traditional experience had been that if they wanted to download an application, they would be sent to one of the Microsoft Remote Desktop apps. This now pops up, and it is the new preferred experience, especially if we're doing one user on one device connecting to one remote device. When you click on this, will take you to the Microsoft Store, where you will actually have access to download the Windows 365 preview. It does call out here in the store that at the moment, this is a Windows 11 product only, but hey, you know what? It's pretty well reviewed. We do expect it's going to be backported to Windows 10 eventually, and we are still looking for some of the advanced functionalities around things like task switching and boot to CloudPC in offline mode, right? So what we have with it right now, though, is a application that is installed on your computer that actually mimics the experience that the user had traditionally on the web, right? When we use things like the more the remote desktop application, we didn't have access to restart, restore, rename, troubleshooter system information. Now we have that access. And again, these are the same functionalities that we have when we're looking at the web experience. And we also still are able to use the bigger remote desktop application that then allows us to also do parallel deployments along with our Azure Virtual Desktop, or even gain access to multiple different instances of multiple different user accounts across multiple tenancies, and in line with if we have streaming apps. But this is also the experience that we still need to use today if we want to do things like selecting which display gets our Windows 365 machine. So I actually have two displays right here. When I was in the office all the time, I had three. It was very common for me to have to come through and pick which display I needed to present all this content onto. Now, this application, in addition to being able to get to both Windows 365 and AVD, is also what the experience is that we have connecting to Windows 365 from Android, right? So it's actually a very similar experience. We have all of our workspaces and all of our environments presented to us in very much the same method. And you may have seen the video, you may not. We did a video last year where I came to the office for an entire day with no PC. I used solely my Samsung phone with DeX mode to emulate Android OS, plugged it into a docking station, used my external monitors, keyboards, mice, and all that kind of fun stuff. And actually the phone worked great. We really didn't experience any interruptions when I was on calls or meetings or anything. So we know it works. It works across all the different platforms, and that brings us to discussing what those platforms are. And this is still a really important discussion, right? Because as we have moved into this new Windows 365 app, we need to understand where the feature capabilities and compatibilities exist and where they don't. We've seen a lot of improvements in that Windows 365 app. This actually still launches the remote desktop AVD solution. So actually, there's still piggybacking. This still actually looks the same as it did on the back end. But there had been this Microsoft Store remote desktop client. And you might notice that it has a lot of red X's. Microsoft has discontinued development of that tool, but it is still available out in the store. So when you send your users to Windows 365 and they are presented with a list of applications they can download, you want to click those rather than going hunting on your own, because it'll get you a better experience. But within these applications, and we have touched on this before, we have drained this slide pretty exhaustively in the past. We do have the ability to bring in keyboards, mice, touch, pen, cameras, clipboards, local drive, microphones, printers, scanners, smart cards, speakers. Like, if you can plug it into a serial port or a USB, we can do it, right? The one thing that I will caution is that if you are using the traditional MSTSC, the traditional remote desktop application, the two things that it cannot do are multi-factor authentication and Teams optimizations. So bear that in mind. Please don't use that in production. It's time to move on to exciting new applications. Now, we did talk a little bit about what's still expected to come in this, and one of my favorite features that we're still expecting to see with this new app is this concept of the task switcher. And I want to highlight this really quickly. This is a simulated experience right here. I produced this image, but what we expect to see is, if you're used to having multiple desktops, right, where you have local desktop 1, local desktop 2, we will actually have the ability to access Windows 365 or our CloudPC as if it were a third or an additional desktop available to us, right? There's some really fascinating implications with what that could mean, and we are still hanging on the announcements of what that's going to look like, because right now, I can grab any one of these applications and I can drag it from one desktop to another. I'm really excited to see if that's a feature that's going to be supported in Windows 365. We still don't know. But a lot of amazing, super cool capabilities that have popped up in the app right now. I highly do encourage that if you're using the traditional applications, take a look at the new one, because it does give the user the ability to do the restart, the restore, reprovisioning, all that kind of fun stuff that traditionally had been web-only workloads. Now, all the app exhausted, right? Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that have popped up here recently too. I mentioned that we have localization. Localization is what's going to give us the ability to determine the language and region settings for our devices. And we have gotten a lot of different language and region settings. Now, if you have been delivering this kind of experience through a VDI solution, and again, I'm picking on Azure Virtual Desktop just because I also have it in my environment, you may know that deploying these is not a straightforward solution. Once you've done one, you can do them all, but getting to the point where you can do any of them means going and pulling code and putting it in repositories and assigning it to devices and doing all that stuff. This is not that. We just decide that for this provisioning policy, which is going to deliver a like-for-like experience across a bunch of users, we're going to deploy this language to these users, and that's it. Okay, so localization has continued to improve dramatically. This localization is truly from the moment Windows starts all the way through their full experience. So it's not like we're running multiple language packs and we have to switch back and forth for the user. This is Windows deployed in that language for these users. And we'll talk a little bit about auto patch, but not a whole lot, because you can actually have these devices pre-enrolled into auto patch, and that is a relatively new capability, but it's not really specifically a Windows 365 thing, so we'll cover that in a later event. The other thing that I think is probably the most transformative experiential change in Windows 365 in the entire time the product has been on the market has been the introduction of RDP Shortpath. Now, this is not a Windows 365 diagram. You will notice that it says Azure Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, but it was developed for that product and it was ported into Windows 365. But I got to tell you, the way that we got it in Windows 365 is actually even better, because what we used to have to do to enable this. Now, let me actually go back for a hot second and tell you what it actually is. So RDP Shortpath says, I am on a public network, or I'm on a trusted network, and I don't want to have to route through a remote desktop gateway to connect back into my Azure Virtual Desktop or my session host or my Windows 365 device. I can see it. I want to connect directly to it. And what that allows me to do is actually bypass all of this infrastructure once the connection has been established and go UDP only. So we're not worrying about all the TCP overhead that goes into communicating this. We're treating it like it's a real streaming application, which is sort of exactly what we've been trying to do. And getting rid of that TCP overhead, all those CRC checks, can actually deliver, and I can tell you, I've experienced it here, a 5-fold improvement in the speed to connect to these remote devices, a 5-fold improvement in performance. That's huge out here in the country because I am on wireless LTE, and I have 24 megabits to play with, and it gets consumed pretty quickly with kids and streaming and all kinds of fun stuff like that. But if I can connect to it, I can deliver that experience, and I can do it with only the bandwidth necessary to stream a movie, right? So it's incredibly powerful. Now, when it first arrived at Windows 365, it did it in a convoluted method. We actually had to use proactive remediations as a component of endpoint analytics out of Intune. And to do that, there was this cumbersome process where an admin had to first go in and attest that you own the licensing to use these mechanisms, right? And then you had to go and build out this whole detection script and a remediation script. And the remediation script looks pretty icky if you're not a PowerShell kind of person, or whatever. I don't even know what the code is, right? It's not my problem. I actually had to just grab it off GitHub because I couldn't figure out how to do it myself. All of this is gone. We don't have to use proactive remediations for this anymore. Now it is as simple as creating a administrative template configuration profile to set this to disable. But guess what? We don't even have to, because by default, this is disabled. So now RDP Shortpath has gone from it only existed for AVD to I had to do it through proactive remediations to I have some way that I can do it natively to I don't even need to do it at all. So now the only time when we actually need to worry about RDP Shortpath really at all is if there's some situation or scenario where you're working behind like a double natted environment or some kind of crazy firewall that's doing, deep level packet inspection, any kind of crazy stuff like that, then we might have to worry about actually disabling this. But the default behavior now is allow these devices to use UDP and connect directly to Windows 365 with the faster connection mechanism. And here it is. You can verify when you're connected to a machine. You can click on the little 5 bars that show your connection capability, and it'll pull up and tell you that you're connected, UDP is enabled. It'll tell you that you're not using a gateway, right? You're bypassing all that infrastructure, and you're just connected directly to the machine, and life is good. It's so much better than it used to be. All right. Performance reporting and utilization reporting has come a long way as well. These used to be things that kind of had to be inferred or you had to pull it out of the other endpoint analytics content. We now actually have direct view into our CloudPC utilization, where we can come in and look and see, are the users using the service that we're paying for them, right? I've hammered on that concept over and over and over again as we've talked about everything across our entire compliance estate through our Microsoft 365 journey. Are the users using the tools that we pay for, right? We can actually now see that. We can see how much time they're spending connected to it, how long it's been since they last connected to it, and we can actually dig into this content and we can see, okay, they were on, but they were only on for 28 minutes, right? So like maybe the pilot has some work to do. Maybe we need to reach out and establish, is this working the way that we need for our users? And it actually gives us some great information too. We can actually dig into these pre-calculated reports and look at, connectivity status. And this is really cool because it digs down and shows you all the elements that would be necessary for your connectivity to improve and whether or not they're in pass-fail state. And you can look at it over time too. So really fascinating, really great stuff that's tied directly to the actual device, right? So you can abstract it to say all my cloud PCs, or you can come in and look at any one specific particular cloud PC. The next thing that's happened is we have gotten beta or preview access into the CloudPC APIs on the Microsoft Graph API. And I've been using this a fair amount recently to help create logic apps to do things like determining when a CloudPC has been deployed to a user and automatically sending them a message to let them know their device is ready. You can use this to do all kinds of really cool stuff like detect the provisioning status, detect when machines are in their, if they've been deprovisioned, but they're still in grace period and the user needs to get back up and running on another device quickly. You can actually build Azure application integrations that, again, query right off logic apps, just go through, get all this stuff. And this also means that we can now directly access this content through PowerShell. Now, it may be a question of why do we need this, right? If everything is supposed to be directly managed through Intune devices, why do we need our own separate interface? Well, it actually turns out that some of the things that are done with cloud PCs were invented in Azure to support cloud PCs directly. And I'll get to that hopefully in a little bit here, but really the principal one is there was no native method to be able to onboard 1,000 devices at one time. So in creating that, there needed to be a way to query that content. So Graph API support, super cool. Again, I'm not going to go into all the other stuff. GCC and GCC High customers, you can absolutely do cloud PCs now. We've seen it expanding across more regions globally for Azure, and the ability to launch machines directly into SSO, having users not have to get that interstitial logon method or interstitial logon when they were actually connecting to the machine. So really cool stuff. Now I want to talk though and switch gears a little bit about and talk about like the common misconceptions that we encounter pretty regularly with regard to the deployment and the support of Windows 365. When it first launched, we absolutely had to have these things connected to an Active Directory, right? And that meant that in order to pilot Windows 365, we needed, if we didn't have an Active Directory, to build one, to connect to it, to do a whole lot of administrative overhead that we just spent the last 4 or 5 years saying we were trying to move away from. None of that is the case anymore, nor do we have to go all in with Windows 365. So let's talk about that a little bit. The overview document on deploying Windows 365 has 5 steps and only 2 of them are mandatory. Used to be that you had to come in here, and they've renamed this create Azure virtual or Azure network connection. This used to be create an on-premises network connection, right, where you would have to go in and define what domain, what OU you were going to join the machines to. You had to go in and build your delegations. You had to do all that kind of fun stuff, and you still can, but you don't have to anymore. If your workloads are principally in the cloud and hybrid Azure AD join isn't a concern for you, you don't have to do really any of these steps. You can assign licenses and create a provisioning policy, and that's it. You're off to the races. And what that ends up looking like is our newer implementations, our newer deployments, right? If I want native Azure Active Directory joined, I don't have to assign these to a network connection. I can, right? You can see these are all of my legacy deployments that still would go to, my Active Directory, including I am able to do, localization for those environments too. I can deploy any operating system version that's out there with a gallery image that I want to, but I don't have to assign these to Active Directory anymore. The other thing that we heard a lot too was I've already invested in a VDI, and I've got my users and I got my support staff even working in Azure Virtual Desktop. I don't want to layer in the additional complexity of Windows 365. And actually, full disclosure, that was something that we heard back inside our own organization as well. And there was some education requirements that had to go into. You can run these things in parallel. They do not have to overlap, but they can in pretty much any way you want to. And at one point in this particular demo environment here, I had native Azure AD join, hybrid Azure AD join, Windows 365 running alongside Azure Virtual Desktop in both of those same mechanisms. And in fact, at one point, I had one user who had 3 out of 4 environments deployed at one given time. Now, what's fascinating, again, I talked about this remote desktop application, and this is the one that you would go and click download if you're not using the Windows 365 app. This does allow you to see all of those things in parallel, right? This is the one that's going to give you the ability to tweak your displays, but you can see where you can have our Azure Active Directory, or sorry, our Azure Virtual Desktop workspaces in conjunction with our Windows 365, along with our streaming apps. And that actually lights up a really cool capability where we can take a Windows 365 machine and bring our existing AVD streaming apps into that environment. We don't have to tear down anything in order to move into a pilot or even a full deployment of Windows 365. Once we're there, we have the opportunity to go back and review and see, are we overspending for these scenarios? Do we really need to layer them up, right? But that's entirely up to you, and it doesn't add any complexity to do that, because if you can do it in Intune, if you can do it in SCC or System Center Config Man, whatever it's called today, I don't play with that very often. If you can do it in those environments, you can do it in Windows 365. Windows 365 is 100% driven by Intune, unless you have hybrid Azure AD join, in which case you can absolutely throw GPOs at it, right? So if you can do it in Intune, you can do it to Windows 365. And you can see we've actually gotten to the point now where we can actually build out RDS properties profiles, just exactly like we would have had to do granularly and manually in AVD over here in Windows 365. So all the stuff that used to be hard in AVD or in your VDI or whatever is actually really super duper simple. So not only are we saving on costs with all those bolt-on services, we're actually saving in complexity, and that also means we're saving in administrative overhead. And that also means that if I have a machine that deploys from 0 to fully user functional just with Intune, I can do that natively with Windows 365. And again, that's where we see that like 20 minutes to productive, right? It's super crazy how cool we can do it. And we can build these things out, any of these areas that exist in Intune. We have the ability now to do the custom ADMX profile. So we can really do just about anything we want to these devices in Intune, including deploying applications, bundling up things and stuffing them into policy sets, right? So I mentioned that we have this ability to deploy Windows 365 RDS properties, right? Remote desktop properties. If there are things that you do not want to redirect and you've built all that in AVD, it's just right here. It's native for cloud PCs. So then we can also take all of this and bundle it up and build conditional access policies around it too, right? So we can say that, hey, you know what, a Windows 365 machine or a cloud PC should only be accessible from somebody who's already met the minimum requirements. Maybe we are deploying, physical devices, but then in order for you to be able to get into your cloud PC, you need to be coming from a device that we've already pre-calculated to be compliant. So you think about it like a step-up scenario for a privileged access workstation. We don't want people connecting to that privileged access workstation from a home PC necessarily, right? So we want to say, hey, in order to even be able to get into this, I know I got my RDS properties locked down, but I want to make sure that you're coming into this from a device that I already have eyes on and I can already manage. Now, we talk about the financials of Windows 365 a little bit, and we have exhausted this content in other forums and other webinars and other videos, but we do actually see presented curated enterprise offerings for common use cases, and I want to touch on these a little bit because this is where we can really show some cost differentials between, again, cloud PCs and traditional VDI, right? So we have these basic light productivity tools and web browsers. And full disclosure, in my demo tenant, I have several of these and several of these. I do not have any of these, right? I don't have any high performance Visual Studio, Power BI, Dynamics, whatever. But if you do, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy them brand new top of the line laptops every 4 years, right? You can stuff them in this guy and actually potentially save yourself a ton of money. So when we start comparing apples to apples, right, we want to deliver a cloud PC to a user, and we look at doing this with those common curated options, right, 31, 41, and 66, and we try to build an equivalent environment in our existing VDI. And again, I'm not picking on AVD. It's a fantastic product. I can just do direct comparison of capabilities, right? I can look at CPUs, RAM, and memory, and I can compare that directly across Azure Marketplace offerings. And I can see what the standard run rate is for those machines. I can see what it would cost me if I ran it as a reserved instance. I can see what the run rate would be if I only used it as an admin console for 40 hours a month. And I can calculate, what it would look like to run it 40 hours a week, okay? And if I do that and then I bolt on the additional storage so that my users can actually save documents into it, I end up with a range of costs. And where it's green, it costs less than a cloud PC. Where it is not green, it does not. And I'm going to tell you, in order to get to beating cloud PCs, we have to do minimum user experience of start on connect in Azure Virtual Desktop, which means that the device actually has to boot up as part of the user connecting to it. And that means that the user is going to have to sit there and wait for that device to connect, to boot. It also means that in general, we're tearing down this machine when they disconnect or shortly thereafter. So we are not delivering a persistent session for this user, right? In order to undercut the cost of a cloud PC, I have to make sure that this machine is parked when the user is not using it. In order to get to a point where we can even run a 1-year reserved instance on even just standard disk, right, and let it just bake, I can only do that with the lower tier machine. Once we get into this mid tier where we're talking $41 a user a month, I cannot optimize this machine to the point where it delivers an acceptable user performance and is available to the user with persistence. I can't do it. I cannot undercut that $41 a month. Now, that $41 a month, you can do the head math and you can run this out and say over 4 years, that's just about $2,000. So why would I not just buy them a $2,000 laptop? And that's where we go back into the study that was talked about with the time to deliver, time to support, time to recover devices after a user termination, right? All of those things are not necessarily fixed with the actual device, but they do add a lot to the cost of supporting that device. There's usually up to a week to 2 weeks of lost time without the device when a user is terminated remotely and you're expecting that device to be returned. If you have hired somebody else in that time, you are pulling another device out of inventory to service that user. That is lost time with that device. And now you potentially have a stockpile of spare machines that you have to calculate the cost of those across your entire user base. We can actually eliminate almost all of that, right? I can pretty well guarantee you if you're hiring a remote worker or even somebody who's going to be in a hybrid scenario, you probably, or they probably actually already have something to connect to the internet. And that means that you can probably get them to connect to your machine, and we don't have to worry about it being unsecure because, again, we can tie it to things like conditional access. We can use our existing security workloads that are across the entire Microsoft 365 estate. So lot of talk about money. Again, we have talked about this in depth a little bit more in the past. I highly encourage go back and look through the content that we already have out there. I want to talk about some of my favorite use cases that I've seen. So we have actually seen some really cool capabilities around kiosk deployments, where actually we can deliver. And let me just dig right into it. All right. So when I deliver, and Christina at her introduction, she mentioned that I am routinely traveling to deliver productivity and security immersion experiences. What these used to look like was me lugging a big box of machines or having them drop shipped from Microsoft to a customer site. We would show up the day early. We would, set up all the machines, and then users would come in the morning and they would connect to those devices, and for 4 hours they just bang them and try to beat them. I don't have to do that anymore. I actually can now roll up in any customer site, have them log in through like an incognito tab or whatever into my demo tenant. I can deliver what's called an access package out of Azure Active Directory Identity Governance. And when they activate that access package, it delivers to them in real time a Windows 365 machine, the application to connect to it, a few applications, and other SharePoint sites, right? And within 20 minutes, we can take that user from having to use a web experience of Outlook and Teams and all that kind of fun stuff directly into a full Windows 365 instance. And what's really cool about this is that by using it this way, this machine doesn't exist. It is not an attackable surface until the user clicks on request access to that. And it also means that at the end of that session, because I've got this thing running for only 8 hours, this goes away. So this machine is not only not attackable in advance, it is not an attackable surface afterward. And that really lights up some amazing capabilities, again, around the concept of privileged access workstations. If you haven't looked at access packages, this is sort of what the experience looks like. The users log in to myaccess.microsoft.com. They're presented with a bunch of potential access packages. If they have access to request those packages, they hit request, and Microsoft Identity Governance delivers those packages in real time. It actually adds the users to the groups in real time and then takes them back out when access is removed. So again, it's 100% just in time. It doesn't exist before, it doesn't exist after. But simply by adding the user to that group, adding them to the group that deploys it, this group right here owns the licensing. This group right here is targeted by the provisioning policy, and this group right here is targeted by this policy set, which if you haven't looked at policy sets in Intune, again, we have a lot of work around what they do and how they work, but they allow us to take our favorite apps, our favorite device management profiles, compliance profiles, and whatever, and stuff them into one deployment and shove them at a device. So I can actually, from zero to fully built, fully deployed with Chrome installed with a web link on the desktop for LinkedIn, absolutely start to finish 20 minutes. And we can deploy that and repeat it all over the world. And then we can actually track and see, is this actually happening, right? So again, this is not a function of the Cloud PC. This is a function of identity governance, but it's delivering the Cloud PC, and I can see over time that my users are actually being added to and removed from this group programmatically through this identity governance tool. So we can get in here and we can get very, very specific about looking through our logs, right? So that also means that we can tie this to identity lifecycle management, right? So if you have your Azure Active Directory connected to something like an HR system, right? Workday or ADP or whatever it is that you may have. If you've looked at identity lifecycle workflows, you can actually have users added to groups either in advance or on the day of hire, and you can absolutely have this be part of the day one provisioning. So again, this machine doesn't exist until the user's first day on the job. The machine gets deployed, they get connected to it, and they are off and running day one without having to wait for a laptop to be shipped to them. And that also means that we can actually pull it right back out on the day of departure, because that is a supported identity workflow. Anyway, so I mentioned privileged access workstations, and I mentioned even making sure that you're coming from a pre-vetted device in order to be able to connect to a privileged access workstation. This is a really awesome capability and use case for Windows 365 and Cloud PCs. Again, we have our deployment or our provisioning policy that simply creates these machines. And you'll notice in this particular case, these are not running the Microsoft 365 apps because not again, because generally you don't want anybody connecting to a privileged access workstation who can also send email, right? That's kind of written in blood in Microsoft's best practices guidebooks. So we can deploy an application or an image from the gallery that doesn't include those optimizations. Maybe we feel like we need to stick with a long-term servicing branch kind of equivalent or something that we've already trusted for a while, so we can stick with an older version of Windows 11. Then once we do that, we can target that with a different policy set that says we want to leverage Windows information protection, which is deprecated, but I still have it. We can do, device management. We can actually set a very, very specific and strict compliance policy against this. Again, if you can do it in Intune, you can do it with these devices. And I absolutely love and highly encourage people look at using CloudPCs for these kinds of scenarios. And again, tie it to compliance policies, tied back to access packages so that users can actually not only request the device, but they can actually also request the entitlement, the privileged identity at the same time as requesting access. So there's no attackable surface. They do their job, and then there's no attackable surface again. It's fantastic. I absolutely love it. So I mentioned that we have also seen kiosk support, and this was actually one of the first challenges that I was asked to solve for an organization. They wanted to look at Windows 365. They wanted to look at it for seasonal workers. And we've seen this scale up now, not just to seasonal workers, but also workers in areas that might have reduced application sets. So, dock workers, warehouse workers, factory workers. You want to present those people with a reduced set of applications, and you want to be able to put them onto new hardware instantly if that hardware fails, because it might be in a challenging physical scenario to support, right? So you might have older devices that work there. I actually spent months working in a chemical plant where they could not replace the physical devices on site with anything newer than Gateway 133 megahertz machines, because only those Gateway machines could survive the chemicals in that facility, right? So they were tied to aging hardware for years. So if you're in that kind of scenario and you know that you don't have you can't just keep a giant pile of ancient machines to deploy, you can actually get users back up and running pretty quickly by saying it's just a shell. It just connects you to the application. The application gets you to Windows 365, and that machine is running in kiosk mode. And kiosk mode allows you to take a Windows 365 or Cloud PC or even physical device if you want to, and run it like it's an old Windows 8.1 environment, right? It looks almost like an iPad. It's got only the applications that you have pre-pinned onto that desktop. Users can't necessarily break out of those applications. They don't have easy access to get to the control panel or do anything funny to it. They can't tweak it. They can't change the background image. You control all of that, and the users simply have big access easy buttons or small or medium access easy buttons. Again, it looks a lot like Windows 8.1, but this is also really cool, again, for seasonal workers where you're getting them in to work on 1 or 2 or 3 particular workloads, right? You need them to take the rows from the Excel document, put them into the Word document, and email them. You do not need them to spend 8 hours watching YouTube. We can do that. Right? We can absolutely package up just those applications, or even think about it in like healthcare scenario, right? Doctors and nurses who are walking around from station to station and they need to be able to get into 1 or 2 applications and they use it like a tablet. We can deliver that experience with Cloud PCs. And that's really cool because one of the challenges you see in healthcare is with a multi-person device, their sessions are not persistent on the physical machine. So they lose work if they walk out of the room, pull a card, the next person comes in, sticks their card in, and logs in. They have now lost their session. If Windows 365 is sitting on the backside of that session connection from the physical device, then when they come back in and log back into the physical device and they fire up the app, they're back in their session and they haven't lost any work. And that by itself can save so much time in the healthcare industry. It's one of the biggest challenges I see pretty regularly. So, all right, that was a lot, right? So those are some of my favorite use cases. We've talked about the changes that are out there. Highly encouraged, take a look at the actual public roadmap that exists. And then, some of the preconceptions around, methods that have to be in use to deploy it. Hopefully you've seen where we can actually save a fair amount of time and money and actually support our workers, whether they are, high workload people doing Power BI all day long, or even just all the way down to literally just copying rows out of a document and sending it to somebody else. So with that, I want to open it up. If anybody has any questions, please feel free.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Adrian. That was great. And I will apologize. We were talking earlier about the hybrid, work from home, work from office. Apparently, technical difficulties do happen in the office too. So I apologize that your camera wasn't on until a little bit in. But we did have some great questions for you.
Okay.
So you showed 3 Microsoft RD apps. Is there a plan to bring the Microsoft Store RD client app to parity?
No, there is not. I think I actually did mention that Microsoft has stated that they are no longer developing that product. Whoops, I have the wrong names up here. This is from a previous Q&A, so
it's okay.
Yeah,
they don't need
yeah.
them. Adrian is Adrian is important.
So
that's why I said the first speaker earlier. See, I jinxed it. We both did that.
Yeah, we both did it. So anyway, we'll put that back up here. Anyway, so no, the store application that is called Remote Desktop Client that has the same name as the one that's in the Windows 365 app and also has the same icon is no longer being developed. I am looking forward to it not being in the Microsoft Store anymore because it really only causes confusion at this point. But no, there is no further development on that product.
Gotcha. Okay. So it seems to be far behind the others in feature support. Is there any reason not to enable RDP Shortpath?
So there are actually a few listed scenarios in which RDP Shortpath is not recommended or even not supported, which I think is actually really interesting because, with the permutations over time from it going to not existing to now being the default state, I think that you would never really need to go in and build the policy or the profile that I did that has it configured. You would only ever need to go in and build policies that disable it for those users that, again, sit behind like a double NAT or something that's doing packet inspections, or there's a couple of other scenarios that are actually out in a Microsoft KB article that I stumbled across a couple days ago. But there are very few scenarios where you would want to turn that off because, again, it's a 5-fold performance improvement for having RDP Shortpath enabled.
Right. Okay, next one. So if a cloud PC is the same as a Windows PC, why is there a whole separate Graph AI API for it? Ooh.
Yes, so I did want to talk about that. Yeah, so when Microsoft first launched CloudPC, the reason why they created it as Active Directory join only, hybrid Azure AD join only, was because there was no mechanism that supported adding 1,000 devices at a time into Azure Active Directory. So the only way you could bring in the number of machines that you could support in a Windows 365 deployment was if you had Azure AD Connect duplicate those machines from on premises. So you really had to go backward to go forward. What we got in January of last year was basically they had to invent a new mechanism to ingest new devices. And as I have been digging through APIs and looking at trying to manage things like sending end user notifications, the properties that are presented to Intune are not actually there. They are being I don't want to say proxied, but there's a feature, there's an attribute called primary user in Intune. And if you query a Cloud PC, you will notice that primary user and enrolled by user are actually empty values. So we need some mechanism to query those attributes, right? We also then need a way to do things like ending a grace period. So we want to reclaim a license from a user and assign it to somebody else, or we want to target a user with a different provisioning policy. We need to be able to directly touch those attributes, and we need to be able to do it at scale so that it's not reliant on an admin to go into the console and end those. Again, what that also then enables us to do is take that API interface and expose it to an application registration, which then allows us to use logic apps and other advanced features that exist across the Microsoft estate. So it is actually important because they kind of had to invent methods to do it, methods that don't present the real data that we would expect in the interfaces that we already had.
Okay. And I will double check if this isn't the last question. I hope it is because this is a big one. But drum roll, please.
All right.
Any word, or I was bad one. Any word on offline mode?
No, you can still go out and watch the Microsoft Mechanics video that talks about it's an upcoming feature, and it's a great video, right? Because I don't think they faked it in the video. I think they really did show a CloudPC running in actual offline mode. So I think the work has been, I think the prototyping has been done. I think the scaling is what's not there yet. And I still believe, and again, I've spoken about this in the past, that what I think this is actually going to be. We know that Microsoft has said it's only going to be supported for larger physical machines, right? And what I mean by larger is more RAM, more processor, more, right? I still believe that what that means is that we're going to be doing something like running Hyper-V on the local host and doing Delta shipping between the remote device and what you're looking at. So I think, and this is pure speculation, that an offline mode CloudPC will actually be running principally in Hyper-V and then shipping logs out to CloudPC. I think the challenge is scaling that up. I think the challenge is getting that to a point where it can be done across your entire digital estate, or determining what is a more powerful or less powerful machine to support that workload. I am very excited to see where it's going to go, but yeah, we don't have any word yet on when that's going to go.
That's a huge.
It really is.
Yeah. So those are all the questions that I'm seeing right now, but if anyone has any more in the chat, please drop them in. And if you're doing that, I will say again, thank you so much, Adrian. And thank you for everyone for attending today. You will receive a follow-up email with the recording to this webinar by tomorrow. In the future, please be sure to keep up with us on social, subscribe to our YouTube channel. So I know Adrian has said it a couple times, and we have so much, all of his recording, we have so much great content, both previous content around Windows 365 to security to Power Platform. Please check out our YouTube channel and check our events page for more upcoming webinars. And I am not seeing any more Q&A, so I will give you all, 8 minutes back in your day, as my boss always says. But I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And thank you again, Adrian.
Thank you.